I just want to first acknowledge those final comments from my colleague. I agree. I think that was exactly the issue that needed to be put on the table. That a child of 12 years old becomes notorious for his age, and the real crime and those who commit the crime, because he did not commit the crime, he did not wield the bat. Those who do commit the crime become anonymous out of the notoriety driven by a young person, of a child, and what is done to that child by the legal system, which has no capacity to deal properly with issues like this. And the problem with this legislation is that it does not help, it makes it much, much worse. Because by not recognising that children as young as 12 are children, that they might know what they do is wrong, but they cannot understand the consequences of what they do, must never be treated as if they are anything other than the children that they are. They must only ever be treated in the context of their family, in the context of their community, in the context of the care and protection issues that Judge Breecroft talked about, because that is the only way to make sure that that child gets the help that that child needs, however heinous the crime. And sometimes the crime can be terrible, but this is still a child. Not a young adult, not an adult, a child, and that child must be treated with all the possible care to make sure that they are well and healthy, and that they never commit that act again, and they never suffer as they must have had, such that they committed that crime in the first place. But this bill doesn't do that. This bill does not treat the issues around children who offend. This bill simply attempts to treat them like young adults, meeting some need of a community that prefers punishment to care, that prefers punitive action to preventing recidivism and crime. So the Green Party will oppose this legislation at this stage and at the third reading. At the first reading of this bill, I wasn't able to be on the Select Committee for most of the time that the bill was being dealt with and that submissions were being heard. But at the very first reading of this bill, I did acknowledge that there were some good measures in it around extending the orders of the Youth Court, for example, and giving the Youth Court more tools to deal with with young adults or young people who go into that court. And I can see that the Select Committee has tried to make some positive contributions and changes to the legislation. It's good that an admission of a prior offence at a family group conference can't be used to then escalate that offending or that child through the process. It's good that there is an attempt at least to try to keep 12 and 13-year-olds in the youth court as opposed to in the High Court and other courts, and that there is an attempt to try to restrict the time that 12 and 13-year-olds will spend in police custody. I can see that there has been some legitimate attempt to try to make the bill better, but the problem, of course, is that the bill is fundamentally flawed, because the premise on which it's based is that 12 and 13-year-old children should be treated as young adults, and that is simply inappropriate and wrong, and will cause more offending later on because the way that these children will be dealt with. The bill is contrary to the New Zealand's obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that alone should signal to the New Zealand community that legislation like this and policies of the national government, driven of course by the extreme radicalism of the ACT Party, are really driving legislation around crime issues, driving New Zealand really back to the 19th century, not taking the most recent evidence about what works to reduce crime in the community and what works for young people in reducing their risk of offending, and what works to prevent families from being in a situation where their kids might offend. None of that is incorporated into the policies of the national government or the ACT's extremist agenda. All of that extremism on that side of the house is really geared towards making New Zealand a much more punitive country, one that cares even less for families and for children, and driving the penal system back into the 19th, even 18th century. I guess one other concern I would have related to that is that this government has wasted thousands of dollars on this ridiculous piece of legislation, thousands of dollars that could have been better spent elsewhere, or on policy development that would have gone into policy development that would have looked at how to prevent children from being even in the situation such that that kind of offending was even likely. Because the legislation admits there's only about 1,000 children in New Zealand that it might apply to, and only 100 for the most serious offending, which begs the question of why all the resources put into just those few, when in fact if we can put more resources into the 200,000 children, for example, who live in the most severe poverty, we might get a much, much better outcome. And in fact, I won't even qualify it. We would get a much, much better outcome if we put the resources into the children and families who need it now, rather than wasting time at this other end with legislation that's unnecessary. The truth is that there are no plans, and this has been already expressed tonight in the House, there's no plans to increase access to drug and alcohol treatment for children. No. Let's have a look at the evidence. We know that in prisons, for example, there were 500 places for drug and alcohol treatment out of 8,000 prisoners in New Zealand. That has recently been increased to 1,000 people. 1,000 people. So we know that while some 80-90% of crime committed is due to drug and alcohol issues in this country, which leads to the imprisonment of 8,000 people, or near enough, that only 1,000 of them are going to get any access to any kind of drug treatment. And not only that, but it is those who are in jail for longer that will get access to that drug treatment, those who are in jail for lower level crimes for which this intervention would be effective at preventing them from reoffending, don't get access to it. Because it only applies if you've been, if you've got a sentence of 3 months or longer. So the whole system by which this government is looking at drug and alcohol rehabilitation services fails from the outset, because there is no plan and no properly thought out scheme for how to deliver those kinds of services to the people who need them to prevent reoffending, to help keep the community safer. And that same failure applies across the board, including to rehabilitation for drug and alcohol rehab for children at risk, or young people at risk. There's certainly very little in this latest plan of John Key's to increase access to health or education services for young people and for children at risk. And in fact, all of the attention, the $26 million, for example, is going into standards, which will simply just tell these children, particularly those most at risk, just how stupid they are. And not only that, will tell the whole country just how stupid they are. John Key, in his statement yesterday, said that the government would look at intervening aggressively in those schools that fail to meet the standards. Now, if that is not a direct threat to those schools who find the most difficulty with the most kids, like the kids that are really at risk, how are they expected to be able to meet standards under those conditions? With kids who are most at risk, kids who are hungry, kids who are cold, kids who aren't sleeping, kids who are sick because of the housing that they're in, and yet this government isn't going to help. They're going to aggressively intervene in those schools, because those schools will be identified as failed schools, because the kids at those schools will be identified as failed kids. There's no plan on that side of the House for dealing with the reality behind those children's lives, such that there is a real intervention in providing them with the education they need, the support services they need, and the schooling system and the health and education and the housing that they need. Raising benefits to make it possible for their families to live and buy good food and good clothing. That would really help. Increasing wages such that people don't have to be the working poor. They don't have to be the working poor. They are able to work full-time and take care of their kids and provide good housing. Building state housing, as I suggested earlier, so that the 10,000 families on the waiting list for state houses have somewhere to live and their kids have somewhere to live, and they are able to go to school, and the same school, they're not having to move school to school because their housing is so insecure. Basic systems, basic services that would support the families of these kids who are most at risk. So we don't need stupid legislation like this, because our children will be being properly cared for by their families, because they live in an economic and social system that cares for them. Because we do not have this in this country. Those children live without any care from the social and economic system in this country. The inequality in this country is getting worse. We already have the 6th worst inequality for highly developed countries. It is a failure. It is shameful. What does this legislation do for those kids? Nothing. It makes it worse. It makes it worse, and we are